Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Supporting Volunteer Ombudsmen and Minimizing Risk. My name is Amity Overall-Lave, and I'm the Manager for Ombudsman Program and Policy with the National Ombudsman Resource Center. If you attended our first webinar on this topic on April 30th and are joining us again, thanks for coming back. We appreciate your understanding about the audio issues we experienced and hope we don't have similar issues today. We're very pleased to have Sarah Hensman, Volunteer Ombudsman Program and AmeriCorps Vista Project Coordinator for the Iowa Ombudsman Program, and Darlene Cray, Volunteer Program Coordinator for the New Hampshire Ombudsman Program, with us today. After I provide a brief overview of risk management and the Ombudsman Program, Sarah and Darlene will share strategies, practices, policies, and procedures that they use when screening and training volunteers to help reduce risk. We will have time for Q&A and a case discussion following the presentations. So you may have noticed that we now use GoToWebinar, so I wanted to provide you with some quick tips for this system. Use the red arrow right there to expand or collapse your control panel. For audio, you can choose to use your mic and speakers on your own computer, or you can call in by using the telephone option. And as I said earlier, all lines are currently muted. For questions, enter questions in this box, and we'll respond during the Q&A after the presentations, or click the hand icon and we'll unmute your line at that time. You may have noticed that we are recording this webinar, and the recording and all the materials will be available on our website after the webinar. So, how to identify and reduce risk? According to nonprofitrisk.org, risk is anything that threatens the ability of a nonprofit to accomplish its mission. Risk management is simply a discipline that enables people and organizations to cope with uncertainty by taking steps to protect its vital assets and resources. Volunteer ombudsmen increase resident access to the Ombudsman Program. They expand your program services, bring a variety of skills and experiences to the Ombudsman role, strengthen the connection between your program and the local community where they serve, and they enhance the quality of life and care for residents and consumers. Volunteer ombudsmen are invaluable, but due to the role of ombudsmen and the reliance on volunteers, there are risks inherent to working with them. Due to the nature of ombudsman work and the fact that ombudsmen are in a position of trust given their access to residents and sensitive confidential information, there are a lot of opportunities for something to go wrong or threaten the ability of the program to accomplish its mission. Working with volunteers involves risk, sometimes to the individual volunteers themselves. So if they are emotionally impacted, if something sad happens to a resident that they are working with, so they're impacted both positively or negatively. Residents can be directly impacted due to risk, or even the Ombudsman Program itself. Have you ever had a rogue or zombie ombi in your program? A rogue volunteer usually has their heart in the right place, and they really do have the right intentions, but their actions are outside of the role or scope of the Ombudsman Program, or simply contrary to your program's policies or procedures. A zombie ombi is an ombudsman in name only. A zombie ombi damages the effectiveness of the program by not submitting reports, not communicating with staff ombudsmen, or acting more as friendly visitors rather than advocates. So in general, they're simply not fulfilling their responsibilities. I borrowed these terms from an article by Dr. Wayne Nelson, a former deputy ombudsman in Oregon, and generally speaking, rogue volunteer ombudsmen are few and far between. But the zombie ombi may be more prevalent. Regardless of the frequency, both of these are examples of potential risk to the program and those you serve, and they need to be addressed. Risk can arise for a variety of reasons: how ombudsmen manage volunteers, the actual work of the volunteer, and/or the volunteer's behavior. Risk management is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time event to analyze and remove potential risk. Ombudsman programs need to consider and plan for risk in each step from recruitment through when a volunteer leaves the program. In the next few slides, I'll address how each step in engaging volunteers needs to incorporate aspects of risk management. For this webinar, our primary focus is reducing risk through screening and initial training, but we will provide some brief tips for consideration after initial certification training. As we've already discussed, there is inherent risk in the Ombudsman role and responsibilities, and that can be compounded with the potential for more highly skilled, engaged volunteers seeking to volunteer for your program today. Therefore, recruiting the right volunteer for your program is the first step in risk management. I want to encourage you to screen in instead of screening out volunteers, since intake and screening is a critical step in reducing risk. Screening someone in for your program is being more selective in choosing them for your program instead of just ensuring they meet the minimum qualifications and then choosing to volunteer for your program. So you need to dig deeper than the minimum qualifications by asking open-ended questions to find out what motivates them in order to identify any bias or agenda or red flags. Take advantage of the NORC online curriculum, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and always remember that it's okay to say no thank you and refer them to another opportunity. You need to develop a screening process for your program. An example of a 5-step screening process from SHIP is to conduct an initial conversation. So whenever the volunteer initially contacts your program, send the application, have an interview, reference checks, and then a background check. A simple 5-step process that you follow with everyone. So like I said, you need to create an intake process and figure out what works best for you and your program. And then standardize that process as much as possible in order to save you time on the front end and make sure that you do the same thing for every person that's interested in volunteering. So one example would be to look at your current program and figure out how volunteers can currently apply to volunteer. Is it only through mail? Do you have brochures, places where they can tear something off and send it in? Can they apply directly on their website? Is there any way that you can make the application process easier for both you and the potential volunteer? Look at your response time after someone initially contacts you and then after the application is received, and make sure that you respond in a timely manner. You don't want volunteers to wait around for a long time and then become disinterested. Make sure that you have an interview process, reference checks, and a background check. Your interview, really from the time that they initially contact you through the entire interview training process, it's like an ongoing interview, but make sure you standardize it and have routine questions and a process. Orientation, you need to have orientation before you go into a facility visit with staff or a mentor. In orientation, you can incorporate, like I said, the NORC online training modules. Perhaps whenever you send them the application, ask them to review a few of the modules from the NORC online curriculum in order to get their feet wet and really have a better understanding of the history and the role of the Ombudsman program before they even start your training process. So that way they are screening themselves into the program and they come to your orientation training already with a foundation of information. And they can screen out. If they find out more information online on their own time and realize this really isn't something that they're looking for, then that saves you and them time. So risk management and recruitment and screening, we've talked a bit about the interview process already, and our presenters today will share some examples of what they do. But make sure that there's a very clear understanding of the job description. So when you interview them, whether it's something in writing, an actual formal job description, make sure that you discuss that and that they understand it and that they agree to what this role is. Discuss and determine actual or perceived conflict of interest, and require signatures for code of ethics and or acknowledgement forms, acknowledging any actual or perceived conflicts, how they can be remedied, if at all, and then make sure they understand how they're supposed to communicate with you when something changes maybe in the future. Reference checks, ideally it'd be great to have at least 2 and have some standard questions that you always ask related to the role and responsibilities of the program and the characteristics that you're seeking in a volunteer. And you could also conduct an online search. Just enter their name into a search engine and see what pops up, if anything, and that's a free way to get some more information. And then, of course, do a criminal background check before visiting the facility with staff and before formal orientation and training begins, because again, that will save you and them time if there's something that you need to screen out for that comes up in their criminal background check, or at least something that you need to talk to them about during that training process related to that criminal background check. As I stated a few slides back, the primary focus for today's webinar is risk management related to screening and initial training. But here are some areas to consider when reviewing potential risks for the duration of the time the volunteer is in your program. So you can look at this in greater detail after the webinar, but I do want to touch on some areas. Training and certification, we've already talked about. Really, training and certification is an ongoing interview process. As people become more comfortable with the program and you as their trainer or whoever their trainer is, they're going to reveal more information about themselves and their interests and their potential agenda for volunteering. So you can identify red flags. So make sure you're always asking questions and getting to know them and building that trust. Have facility visits with staff or experienced volunteers. Establish boundaries, not just that they understand their boundaries and role as a volunteer ombudsman, but also establishing professional boundaries between you and the volunteers of your program. And then, of course, do a final review of all their volunteer activities and his or her training before the end of certification. Reports and data, it's really, really, really critical and a huge risk management area to do a routine review of volunteer reports and discussion of their data with them. So perhaps whenever you're entering your data into your statewide data management system, whatever you use in your state, you're looking at their monthly reports that they submit to you. So review that information monthly and then maybe show them what their reports, what information they gave you each quarter. So show them how many visits they're doing, how many complaints they're resolving, and if there's any cases that you need to discuss with them and how they resolved things. So use it as a teaching point, and also it's a way to keep them engaged and show that they're making great progress and that they're doing great work. Obviously, you want to review policies and procedures regarding documentation anytime that things come up like those zombie ombies that just don't submit reports as they should. So you need to make sure everyone's clear on the requirements for your program and why they have those requirements. Continuing education and evaluation, this is certainly an area for risk management because it gives you an opportunity to review their understanding of new training material. Ideally, if you can, have as many in-person meetings with staff and their peers as possible, because again, in that informal setting, people really open up and share information. We used to ask volunteers in my local area to share some cases that they were working on, and it really gave them a chance to take the spotlight and train their peers, and it gave us a chance to hear what they were doing and see if there's any areas of improvement or potential areas of risk that we need to discuss with them. Have an annual evaluation of both their work, so do a facility visit with the volunteer, develop a standard checklist or questions that you ask during that facility visit or look for during that facility visit with the volunteer. So, you know, are they wearing their name badge? Do the staff and residents seem to know them? Do they know the residents? How do they engage with people? Do they knock on doors? Those kind of questions. Review their data annually with them, and then, of course, discuss their response to an annual survey. I think it's really, really important and critical to gauge their experience as a volunteer with your program at least once a year to find out if there's any areas of improvement for you to work on. And then when a volunteer leaves the program, always conduct an exit interview to figure out why they're leaving. If there's anything that was left undone that still needs follow-up from staff or volunteer ombudsman, if there was anything you could have done better to make it a better experience for them, collect their badge, documents, and any reports, because again, that's a big risk because that's confidential information that you don't want floating out there. And of course, close the full loop by sending a letter to their assigned facility and notify the rest of their program that they're no longer part of your program, because you don't want anyone going in and trying to represent your program that's no longer part of your program. So research suggests that volunteers develop a positive or negative relationship with their volunteer position and host agency within the first 60 days. So it's really, really critical that you establish a good relationship from the very beginning. And here's some quick tips on how to reduce risk due to managing from a distance. Most of the characteristics that make a great advocate, for example, confidence, they're a problem solver, or they're proactive, can also, on the flip side, lead to challenging situations. So for example, a volunteer may go rogue. They may not wait for instructions or call for a consultation in a difficult case. Instead, they may move forward and increase risk to the program and residents, and maybe do something that maybe shouldn't have been done without a consultation with a staff ombudsman. And considering that most of you manage volunteers from a distance, since they're visiting facilities near their home, here's some quick tips on reducing risk. You need to establish connection, communication, and control. Connection, of course, would be developing that personal relationship, provide a warm welcome with both staff and their peers. So again, in-person meetings, maybe circulate a roster with all the program representatives' contact information on it, especially those that live in the same city or county or region. That'll help them feel like they're part of a team. Send a handwritten welcome note, highlight them in your program's newsletter. And of course, program personal contact improves trust and shared values. So ask for their preferred mode of communication in order to make sure that there's a streamlined process to communicate with them. And then set them up, if possible, with a mentor and/or at least have several shadowing visits, which Darlene will touch on later in the presentation. For communication, you really need to establish solid, routine, regular communication in order to reduce isolation. If they feel like they're out there operating in their bubble and that you are operating in your home office, and it could start an us versus them attitude and a fear that they're missing out or that they're not truly part of the team. So you need to establish regular communication. Provide prompt responses when they contact your office. If you can't respond immediately, at least have an out-of-office message so they can have an idea why you didn't answer the phone or the email that day. If possible, even set some office hours. So maybe let people know, your volunteers know that to the best of your ability, you'll try to be in the office on, Monday afternoons or Friday afternoons to receive phone calls. Or set up some kind of hotline where your staff share the line to respond to questions. Control. Control means set priorities, establish clear responsibilities and results, and of course designate checkpoints for follow-up. So anytime anything goes off the rail or they need some additional consultation, make sure you set up some checkpoints along the way to check in with them and see how they're doing. Systems advocacy and involvement in the national network can help retain volunteers, prevent isolation by showing them they're connected to a larger network, and it really shows them that not only does their work directly impact individuals, but it's part of a national advocacy network of ombudsmen. So being part of something that's bigger than them can help prevent burnout, therefore reducing risk. So make sure to share NORC resources with them, like our e-newsletter, the Ombudsman Outlook that comes out quarterly. Share that with them. Share our training materials with them. Introduce them to Consumer Voice. There's a lot of advocacy and events part of Consumer Voice that they could be involved in, like Resident Rights Month or the Residents' Voice Challenge, the annual conference, or the Action Network. especially for those volunteers that are showing that they want to do more than just the individual complaints. Then get them involved and introduce them to consumer voice and larger systems advocacy. And of course, there's other issues and events like World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is coming up in June. Here's one example for developing a risk management process. The first step is to establish the context, which means determine what you're trying to accomplish during this process. For example, if you want to maintain the integrity of your program and protect your program's credibility, then you need to acknowledge and identify the risk, evaluate and prioritize the risk, implement your risk management techniques, and then monitor it, and then of course update as necessary. You need to identify people assets and goodwill assets as well. People assets simply mean the people impacted by your program, so those representing your program and those you serve, and identify potential risk to them. Goodwill would be your current reputation. Identify risk to your current reputation and how to prevent that damage. And as you know, conflict of interest, both actual and perceived, is really important to and directly impacts the effectiveness of an ombudsman program. So identifying that goodwill in your current reputation and any risk to that is critical. And of course, risk management techniques include avoidance and modification. Avoidance is simply if a risk is too high, then not providing that service may be the best option. So for example, SMP, Senior Medicare Patrol volunteers, do not visit consumers in their home. That is to SMP too risky, so they simply don't provide that service. Modification would be adapting the activity to reduce the risk for everyone involved. Risk management plans include clear policies and procedures. Of course, a volunteer handbook is really important. A grievance policy, not just for people outside of the Ombudsman program that have complaints about the Ombudsman program, but for volunteers themselves. If there's something that they're not happy with in their volunteer experience, they need to have a way to communicate that with your program. And then, of course, you need to establish a process for volunteers that are not adhering to your program's policies and procedures and not performing their duties. How do you respond to that? And you need to establish a clear process. Written materials need to be part of your risk management plan, such as an acknowledgement form and a code of ethics. Ideally, reviewing code of ethics at least annually with your volunteers is really important, and having them sign it and keep it with their documentation. You need to have a system for tracking volunteers and documentation. So like I just said, like the acknowledgement form, all the forms they sign during training, all their signatures on continuing education, and tracking those hours. And then of course a system for monitoring volunteer activities, both their reports and what they submit to you, their annual evaluation and experience survey, and then anytime you need to provide additional coaching or performance counseling. So if something comes up in case review and there's an area of concern and you review that with them, provide them more training, and then provide checkpoints, you need to have it documented what you did. So if something comes up in that same area in the future, it may not be just a training issue or lack of knowledge or information. It may be a personality issue or something bigger, identifying a trend of behaviors, and maybe they're not the best fit for your program. So everything needs to be documented. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation, the webinar, over to Sarah. And just one second, Sarah. Okay, there you go, Sarah.
Great.
And I can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to talk about risk management for the Iowa Volunteer Ombudsman Program, basically just the intake. So everything from when we receive their application up to them starting to serve in the facility. So hopefully that will be very informative for you. And like Amity said, risk management is really an ongoing process. It touches everything that you do, from the volunteers coming into your door to when they leave your door. And so I think our program's had a pretty pretty good run at trying to anticipate those risks and respond to them accordingly. A little bit of information about our program. That's me. I head up our Volunteer Ombudsman program for Iowa with the assistance of 2 AmeriCorps Vista members, Karen Reich and Meredith Funke. So shout out to them if they're listening. And if you don't utilize AmeriCorps Vista members or don't know how you can utilize them, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that would be interested. They've been a tremendous asset to the growth of our program. A little bit of context just to kind of prepare you for the rest of my speech. So in Iowa, we divide our regional or local ombudsmen up into 8 areas of the state. So among the 3 volunteer coordinators, we sort of split out by regions, myself covering this area here and this area here, and my VISTA members covering the other areas of the state. So that's how we operate in Iowa. Like most of you, we have a mission. It's to protect the health, safety, welfare, and rights of the residents whom we serve through complaint investigation, seeking resolutions to their satisfaction, and providing advocacy and education just to help the whole community concentrate on quality of life and quality of care in the care facilities in their communities. So the mission of our volunteer program is the same as our overall office. Few other things. We do not count our volunteer activities as cases at this time for the purposes of our AOA reporting data. Even if it was something that they achieved to the residents' satisfaction, we've just determined that we're unable to record that consistently at this point, so we need to shore up a few other things before we can do that. A lot of times they do refer concerns to the local ombudsman that would be sort of out of their purview to handle on their own, and then the local ombudsman might open a case. But we primarily count their visits toward our monitoring visits, those non-complaint related visits that are required to be completed every federal fiscal quarter. Our overall program serves in Iowa just nursing facilities, assisted living programs, residential care facilities, and elder group homes. Our volunteer ombudsmen currently do not serve in assisted living. That's a long-term goal of our program, but as you know, there's different set of regulations there, and we know that we need to adapt some things about how we train our volunteers and things like that. So that's a long-term goal. There are 447 nursing facilities in Iowa, amounting to over 31,000 beds. And then among these next 3 here combined, those are 407 facilities, majority of them being assisted living with 22,628 beds. So we're trying to serve over 50,000 residents in Iowa. A few facts about our program. So the Volunteer Ombudsman Program is kind of the 3rd iteration of previous volunteer programs within our office, but the Volunteer Ombudsman Program is certainly the most formal, the most risk-based, and has had the most oversight from program staff. Previously we had care review committees, that's CRC, and resident advocate committees, or RAC. So we've kind of morphed and transformed over the years and learned some lessons from the low risk monitoring that came along previously. Our program is written into Iowa code. We receive an annual state appropriation. Our first volunteer began serving in September of 2013, so we're still fairly new, and that volunteer is still with us today. So it's been really great to have some of those longer serving volunteers that can remember what things were like before we really had our feet under us. A few numbers. As of this week, we have 119 volunteer ombudsmen serving across the state. They serve in 122 different facilities across 44 counties, and there are 99 counties in Iowa. And as of April, within the whole history of our program, they've completed over 2,000 facility visits and accumulated more than 3,500 volunteer hours. We also like to calculate the value of our volunteer hours in Iowa. If you go to a website called the Independent Sector, it'll give you a breakdown of what a standard volunteer hour equates to in dollars and cents for your state. And so in Iowa, that number's $20.93. So to date, they've contributed in kind more than $73,000 to our program, which is ultimately in service to improve the lives of residents at their facilities. So we like to use that number a lot when we report to our stakeholders about the difference that they are making. So from the moment that we start to recruit volunteers in our press releases, in our online volunteer listings, we list some qualities that we're looking for. We generally are looking for people, of course, that have a strong appreciation for older adults. You might be surprised, but sometimes they decide they don't like being around older people. They find it depressing. So we want to kind of work with that, first of all. The majority of our volunteers are either retired professionals in the long-term care field, or perhaps they're raising children now and have had experience in the past. A lot of them also have had some kind of experience with a family member or as a caregiver in a long-term care facility, and they are seeking to give back. Usually they say, oh, you know, I wish I could have done more for the other residents in the facility. And this is where sometimes we get folks that want to get back at a particular facility or program, and so if they have sort of a negative bias, we look for that immediately and continue to monitor those things. I know a lot of programs have had some success with college students. For us so far, they come to us with a lot of enthusiasm. They want, you know, references and resume fluff and things, but generally we found that college students haven't been able to meet our minimum requirements. They're more of those zombie-ombies. Despite their enthusiasm and best interest, we're a little bit skeptical of their ability to do the minimum requirements for us amongst their busy college schedules. Other things that we look for, we're looking for folks that are responsible, that will meet the minimum requirements for visiting and reporting. We want folks that are professional, especially that they can demonstrate the ability to work cooperatively, especially with the facility staff, to resolve resident concerns. People who have a cool head, you know, can verbalize themselves, you know, without raising their voice, and, you know, use those sorts of tactics. We want good listeners. So are they in it purely for the social kicks because they want to talk to other people, or, and, you know, and can they read into what the resident is saying and what they're not saying? A lot of times, you know, residents may not be verbal about their complaints, but you can sort of read in between the lines. So we're looking for folks that have those types of skills. Objective problem solvers. We want them to understand that there's two sides to every story and try not to jump into conclusions before they understand the full perspective of what needs to be done. Of course, giving the resident the benefit of the doubt, even if they have dementia. So a lot of the red flags I might see in training is if they say, oh, well, you know, if they have Alzheimer's, then you can't listen to anything they say because they don't know what they're talking about. Those are the types of things that we either want to correct immediately, or if, you know, that's a held belief of theirs that that might not be a good fit for our program. And also that they can leave emotions out of the investigation resolution process. Sometimes that's tough because they do develop attachments and relationships with residents, but we always want to make sure that their advocacy can be equal for all residents. Further, when we screen for conflicts of interest, you know, there's the ones that the Older Americans Act states, which we abide by, but we also strive to also read in between the lines of those. Like, do they volunteer with a hospice program that might be owned by an organization that also runs care facilities? So if that's the case, we probably don't want them to be an ombudsman in a, you know, facility owned by a program that they volunteer for in another capacity. So we really try to dig deep into those conflicts of interest, and if there's any kind of perception of a conflict of interest, we try to address that right away. The only conflict of interest that we can offer a waiver for is if they have a relative in the facility, and we've offered that sparingly, and in a general sense, it's worked out marginally well for folks. It's hard for them to concentrate on everybody when they have someone close to them in the facility, but Iowa having so many small towns, they might only have one facility in a county. It can be really hard not to have somebody who's a relative as defined by the Older Americans Act in that facility. But in general, we haven't found that to be too hard to avoid. So I like to say we have an 8-step certification process, although there's probably a million little administrative things within each one of these. we do have some big chunks. And I want to show you a few of our documents that we have here and kind of explain each one of them. So this is our volunteer application. We also have an electronic version that people can fill out for us online and email back. And basically, we just want to collect their basic information. Why do they want to be here? I'd like to hear about what other types of volunteer experiences they've had that might be comparable, something like CASA, SHIP, things that require a lot of responsibility and a lot of attention to detail. We want to make sure that they say they can complete the minimum requirements. We ask them to do 3 hours a month at minimum for at least a year. That they have a way to get to the facility, that they can attend training and those sorts of things. And then the rest is essentially a conflict of interest screening and a signature page. And I believe Amity will or has posted all these on the NORC page, so you can take a close look at them as well. So provided they make it out of that process, we have a phone interview next. So I'll show you, we have a script. This is for the coordinators, and then we have sort of a shorthand form. So we look for those behavioral-based interviewing questions, and we just ask them what their expectations are like to make sure, you know, if they say, oh, well, I want to go in and, you know, feed residents or give them communion or, you know, buy them candy or things like that, we want to make sure that we say right away that that's not what we do. So we want to make sure that we're on the same page. Let's see. So here's some of our behavioral-based interview questions. One of them is confidentiality. So can they describe a situation where they've had to maintain confidential information in the past, and how did that go for them? Other things such as, you know, have you ever been in a situation where you've had to advocate for somebody that wanted to make a decision you didn't agree with, and how did they handle that? Other things like, do they think that they can operate in a facility that's going to have some folks in stages of decline that might pass away, and those sorts of things. We collect their communication style preferences, and then we get them enrolled in training. So that's our script, and then we have a standard form that's just a little bit easier on the eyes. That's it there, which corresponds to the questions that are asked in the script. So we save all that. We have an electronic file and a local file, like all the hard copies, what I mean by local file, for each volunteer. So we record all of their answers in detail, and that can be very helpful to record all of this information if there ever is an issue down the road where they say, well, I never heard that, or, you know, you can kind of go back through the paper trail and say, well, here, you know, this is where we talked about it. So it's good to kind of just collect all that and make sure you store it safely and securely. All right, so after their phone interview, kind of see my notes there, which I'm going to read off, we have a two-part training. The first part is like a 1-hour webinar that we have all the volunteers watch before they attend their local classroom training. The first webinar is basically all the volunteer do's and don'ts, the history of our program, and the ethics of volunteer ombudsmen. So that's an opportunity for them to self-screen out. If they go through that and say, hey, this wasn't the type of experience I was expecting, then they can cancel out their in-person classroom training. So if they go on to classroom training, we actually go out into the field all throughout the state into each of those 8 regions and train our folks when we have a class of about 5 or more folks that are interested. The classroom training, first of all, allows us to meet all of our volunteers in person, which I think is the most important thing you can do, even if you're a big state, is try to meet them all in person or have somebody in your program do that, because I think their responses to the discussion items, their role play, you can really start to detect biases, you can detect personality quirks that you just know are not going to be a good fit for particular facilities, and so on and so forth. So we cover all of the meaty things in the classroom training, all of our policies. We practice observation and communication skills, culture change, residents' rights, dementia, sexuality, abuse. And we also do a number of scenarios, and we kind of work up to them. You know, we'll present a scenario. So here's what's happening in a facility. How do you think you'd respond? We do that as a large group, and we break it down into small groups. And then the last thing that we do with that exercise is we have them role play it. And I know that some people roll their eyes at role playing, but for me, it is the best indication that I can have that they are absorbing what we're talking about and can sort of on command, I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, try to demonstrate the skills that we have just discussed. Are they asking the right questions in the right order? Are they not asking leading questions? Are they not making promises they can't keep? Those sorts of things. So I always want to see them succeed at the role play. And I actually have had volunteers that I've said, you know, I was really concerned about some of your responses in the role play, you know, and for that reason decided not to carry them on in the program. At training, we also have them sign this form, which is our volunteer agreement. So we've got our confidentiality statement here. We also have their conflict of interest disclosure, that at that time we know all of their conflicts of interest and they have an opportunity to kind of fill us in if anything's changed. That they've received their volunteer manual and they agree to read it and understand and abide by the policies therein. So this is a really important one too. If they do go rogue or aren't meeting the minimum requirements and they've signed off on this form, this is kind of your ammo, I guess, to say, hey, you know, we did cover this and you signed this agreement, so, you know, we need to come up with a solution, or if this isn't the right fit, then it's probably time to move on. And then we also have a liability release. There's a lot of things that can happen to a volunteer that are outside of our control, like if they travel to their facility, if they slip and fall in the facility, if they get into a car accident or their car gets hit in the parking lot by somebody else. So in any case, we just want to make a statement that we're not responsible for those types of things and that they can't come back to us and say, hey, you know, you need to cover my, you know, damages here. So we have that as well, and our Attorney General has reviewed that statement. Finally, they sign off. Last thing we do is we want to make sure that they agree that we can identify them with our program in the media, whether it's like a thank you notice we take out in the paper, we want to put their picture in a future brochure, video, something like that. So we do have them sign off on that and record that. All right, I know I'm getting a little bit over time, but a couple other things I want to show you. So after training, we do a follow-up consultation. It's basically a second phone interview. And in this case, what I want to point out to you here, we collect feedback, you know, how training went and those sorts of things. But we also want to ask them some final scenarios. So here's a situation, how are you going to handle it? So your friend's relative is thinking about moving to the facility at which you're the volunteer ombudsman, and they ask you if there are any problems in that facility. You know, we want to hear them, you know, say, hey, the information I have about that is confidential, but try to refer them to some public information. How they would respond to a staff member doing something they believe is maybe wrong. How they would respond to a resident with dementia, telling them a complaint that may or may not be legitimate. And a resident talking about a concern that may be beyond their purview, which would be an involuntary discharge or transfer. And finally, we ask them to verify for us that they want to continue with the program at this point. Because a lot of times, before we had that question, people would move on in the program and we'd say, hey, what happened? You know, we thought we were good, and then they backed out. So we get a verbal go ahead there. And lastly, we do a background check, and we wait until this point because there is some time lag between the time that they first submit their application and the time that they get started in the program. So we try to make their background check as close to their start date as possible, and they don't have any interaction with anybody other than our staff up to this point. So we run the state criminal history background check. Whether or not the results of that impact their eligibility is dependent on what it was. We run the National Sex Offender Registry. If they show up on that, it's an absolute no. We run the Office of Inspector General Health and Human Services Exclusions Database. If they pop up on that, it's a no. And we also run our state child abuse and a dependent adult abuse registry. Dependent adult abuse finding would be a no. If it's child abuse, then we need to talk about the circumstances. We also run an equivalent check if they are residing in a bordering state but wish to serve in Iowa. And we document all of these, and we also look at all of the records if there is a common name hit to rule out what excluded them from that individual. Is it a different birthday, a different photo, different gender, different race? And we have a printout of all of those, and I recommend storing all of your background check findings because there's a lot of legal implications for storing and disseminating them separately, so that, you know, they can't be kind of cross tracked, I guess, but storing them in a separate location and having those backed up. If they do have a finding, this is the evaluation form we use to say, hey, they either can serve in the program or they can't, and here's our rationale. So this is just a part of our background check policy. So we look at, you know, what was the finding? Is it relevant? How long has it been? How old was the applicant when it happened? You know, is it a long rap sheet or is it just one thing? Have they been through any kind of rehabilitation course, paid the fine, whatever? And then we sign off on whether it will or will not affect their eligibility in the program. And we also provide a copy of this in our policy to the folks that are excluded because of their background check policy. Okay, so lastly, we assign them to a facility. And that's when they are certified. And we try to match their facility based on the experience they want to have. Do they want one really close to their house, or does it matter if it's within 20, 30 miles? Do they want a big facility or small? Do they want one that has a memory care unit or not? Do they want a facility that's going to be pretty easygoing and accepting of the volunteer, or a facility that's probably going to challenge the volunteer a little bit? So we try to find the right match based on what we know about the facilities in the area. Just a couple more things. The last thing they do is an orientation with their local ombudsman, where it's just a meeting in the facility with all parties to explain the process. And I have one more form to show you. Oops, I thought I did. I'll have to grab it later if we have time. But essentially, it's just a checklist of what the local ombudsman needs to do at that orientation. So basically, this amounts to the volunteer gets their supplies at that time. We have a point of contact established in the facility, and that's usually the administrator or somebody at the managerial level that the volunteer will always go to with their concerns. They'll check in with that person, they'll check out with that person, and they will verbally explain all the complaints that they have permission to do so to that point of contact and seek follow-up from them. And that way the volunteer is not running ragged to each department. If there's a litany of complaints, they can just go through one person who's a manager that can deliver that where it needs to go. With the staff, we say, here's what the volunteer does, here's what they don't do. We're trying to improve this process because, you know we check off all the boxes, but sometimes it just doesn't stick. And they tour the facility and they shadow with the local ombudsman till the point they feel comfortable. So we want the volunteer or the local ombudsman, excuse me, to demonstrate to the volunteer, like, this is how you approach the resident, this is how you can sort of begin the conversation, how you can start to respond to any complaints, those sorts of things. And after the orientation, the volunteer is visiting solo. The coordinators for the program do a 1-month check-in with the volunteers. We try to get them set up for online reporting, which we have as an option if they'd like to use that. And then we have a minimum contact with them once a month from that point on, and it's usually when we get their report or expected to get their report, and we want to have a chat with them about how things are going. Just a few things about our ongoing certification, and then I'll turn it over to Darlene. For our new volunteers, first-time certified volunteers, it's a period of a year that their certification lasts, and that gives us an opportunity to find out, do they want to continue in our program? Is this the right fit? Were they placed at the right facility? And just kind of do a co-evaluation of each other. They have to do 10 hours of continuing education in that first year, which I think also helps with risk management, just helping them learn more than they were able to learn when they started, that they can start to apply as time goes on. We, of course, check for those minimum requirements, that they're submitting their reports, they're doing their visits, and that they're abiding by all program policies. So it gives us a chance to really check in on people who are rogue if we haven't already dealt with the issue, or if we just know that they're never going to improve. This is our opportunity to break those ties. And we have policies and procedures in place for all of these sorts of things and then some. If you would like more detail, I can either pass those along to you, or Amity, I believe, has posted them as well on the NORC website. And we also continue to develop other practices for engaging and monitoring volunteers. This form here I wanted to show you quickly is our process checklist. So this is kind of all the administrative things that we know we need to do with each volunteer, which allows us to say, hey, we got their application, who reviewed it, who trained them, who completed their background check and signed off on it, and so on and so forth. And this is a 3-year checklist. So did we recognize them? When did they finish their continuing ed? We give them a heads up when their certification's about to expire, so we have those check-ins as well. So I think this is a handy way to just make sure that everybody's following the right process in the right order. We also have an online volunteer data system, which I'd love to show off sometime when I have more time, which is continuing to be developed. That also helps us track a lot of things as well. And then, so as I said, we evaluate volunteers when they apply for recertification, and then after that we go every 2 years and we reduce their continuing education requirements. We also allow volunteers with a year of experience or more to take on a second facility. So it's only a 1-to-1 ratio during their first year, no matter what their level of background is. And then they can take on more facilities if they would like. And we have about a half dozen volunteers now that are taking on 2 facilities for us, which is really, really helpful, especially in rural areas. So I know I went a little bit over my time. I apologize, but that's everything I wanted to make sure I told you today. And if you have any questions, I know Amity will be screening those and taking those later, but now I will turn the presentation over to Darlene Craig, who will talk about her intake and mentoring program. Thanks for your attention. Okay, Darlene, I just sent it your way. You might have to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute on my phone. My name is Darlene Cray. I am the Regional Long-Term Care Ombudsman and Volunteer Program Coordinator for the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a relatively small state, and we're unique in that we are a single state program administratively attached to the Department of Health and Human Services. Our program was one of the first pilot states to begin a long-term care ombudsman program in 1975, and then we were also one of the first states to offer a volunteer program in 1982. Our volunteers are identified as certified ombudsman volunteer representatives, which is consistent with our state law. We are a relatively small state, so in comparison to what Sarah was talking about, we would probably be consistent with our entire state would be consistent with one of their regions. New Hampshire has roughly, for statistical purposes, 87 nursing facilities and skilled nursing facilities, 155 board and care homes, and 3 hospice homes that our program responds to. That's the equivalent of 13,000 long-term care residents and elders living in care. For ombudsman staffing, we have a state long-term care ombudsman, 4 regionals, 1 serving double duty as volunteer coordinator and regional, which is myself. And then currently we have 27 volunteers, which cover 42 facilities. They range in time and service from volunteers that are currently enrolled in a certification class. Their last class is tomorrow, all the way up to 33 years. That particular volunteer did just retire within this past month, and she was in the very first volunteer program class that was offered back in 1982. For risk management, being the volunteer program coordinator for 10 years, it's given an opportunity to transition from emergency response to risk management. And it's also given an opportunity by changing some of our policies and procedures and the way that we provide our education and training to increase our longevity from approximately 2 years to 4 years. We start with screening, and our screening process is consistent with what most other states do: an application, an in-person interview, 2 references, criminal background check, Office of Inspector General, exception report, and going through detailed conflict of interest, which also includes looking at various other information beyond reference checks. We do go into Google and we look and we see if anything pops up that one of the volunteers or potential volunteers may not consider as a conflict of interest. So with our certification, it really is a process. It begins right after screening and transitions to 30 hours of classroom training, 10 hours of mentoring with an experienced volunteer in the facility that they're assigned, and then a recommendation for certification by a peer mentor. Our training, we've had some people talk to us about this, and we've gone back and we've looked at it and determined that all of these areas were really beneficial in providing the education right up front. One, because it made the volunteer more prepared going into their assignment, and also because by going through all of these areas, we were able to identify some conflicts or some trouble spots where we had to talk to the potential volunteer about screening out and looking at another volunteer opportunity for them. And mostly it was because of personal opinions that they would not be able to put aside to advocate specifically for the resident or the interest of the resident that they were serving. So you can see it goes through a number of varying topics. And then from those varying topics, what we have done is we've created we call it the red, yellow, green sheet. And it's set up consistent with a traffic signal. We've taken the codes from the National Ombudsman resource and gone through and identified areas that the volunteer can manage independently as soon as their certification is complete, to the yellow area where we would like them to exercise some caution in reaching out to the office before becoming involved, and then the red area where we ask them to steer clear and identify that right off to the office so that a regional ombudsman can respond to that. The rationale for this is because we found that before we created this document, we were doing a lot of emergency service response. And then afterwards, we pretty much leveled the playing field so that any volunteer, regardless of their abilities to advocate, their background, or their communication technique, were able to be effective. And because they felt effective, they were staying with the program longer and needing less educational support and guidance. To give an example, if you look at the middle section, you'll see access to ombudsman or visitors. This could go in 2 different directions. One would be a volunteer encounters Mrs. Smith. And Mrs. Smith states that her son is unable to visit her during the evening hours. If Mrs. Smith states that the reason her son can't visit is because they can't literally get into the facility. The facility is locked at 7:30 because it's an inner city facility and they're concerned with security and safety. We give the volunteer the go-ahead. Once they call into the office, we say, you're more than capable to handle that. Here are some suggestions. Maybe they could put a wireless doorbell on the door. They could install an intercom system, or at a minimum, a phone number so the person standing outside the door could call from their cell phone. The other avenue would be that Mrs. Smith identifies that her son's not able to visit because her daughter, who is power of attorney for health care, has determined that she does not want the brother to visit because she upsets mom, and she's trying to protect mom's feelings. But Mrs. Smith really does want her son to visit. That gets into an area which could be more a legal definition of what a power of attorney could do, may cause some conflict between family members, and because of that, we've asked the volunteer to pass that on, and a regional ombudsman goes in and deals with the situation, provides the education. If it's a controversial situation, then the regional is going in, handling it, and then once it's resolved, leaving the facility. Where the volunteer visits once a week for approximately 2 hours, it may be a rehashing of that conflict every single time the resident or the family sees that volunteer in place. So what it's been able to do is not only provide that that clarification for the volunteer in what they can respond to, what they need to call in for, and what they need to leave alone, it also has provided the volunteer opportunities for support. And because it's less controversial, we've also found some volunteers staying with the program a little longer. Once the volunteer has completed the 30-hour classroom time, we set them up with an experienced volunteer. We identify them as a preceptor or a mentor. The new volunteer visits with that preceptor for a shadow visit with the mentor at the mentor's assigned facility. And then they start visiting the new volunteer's assigned facility. The preceptor completes a certification checklist, which is competencies that you normally would not be able to do in a classroom setting, like identifying different types of equipment that they would see, identifying where in the building to go to resolve a specific concern, how to engage in a conversation with a person who's living with Alzheimer's or related dementia. Once that checklist is completed, then the mentor completes a form that identifies whether they recommend the volunteer for certification, if they recommend the volunteer for certification with additional training in some areas, or if they recommend that this volunteer not be certified. I've only had one situation in the past 5 years where a mentor has not recommended a volunteer for certification. And what we realized after I went out and completed a couple of visits with that new volunteer, it was a personality conflict between the preceptor and the new volunteer, and also the setting was not appropriate for the new volunteer because of some emotional distress that the person was in due to the recent death of their parent. Once the new volunteer becomes certified, then we keep some ongoing supports in place for that person. And we found that giving the volunteer additional levels of support also reduces those zombie-ombi situations and the rogue situations. It provides a nurturing, ongoing relationship, also provides some direct supervision from the regional long-term care ombudsman in that area, and then ongoing and additional support from the volunteer coordinator. When the volunteers go into the facility, we ask them to visit on average 1 time per week and no more than 2 hours. That seems to be the sweet spot for us here in New Hampshire. Once they complete that visit, we ask them to complete a visitation report, and it's required that they turn that into the office before their next visit. What we found was that these visitation reports were being seen by 3 people. And in being seen by 3 people, we were able to pool those resources instead of 3 people looking at them and then going on their merry way. we started a communication process so that the regional is able to look at it and then provide the direct supervision to that volunteer based on what they see coming in. The volunteer coordinator is then able to provide some continuity to the reporting so that our information is consistent for the end of year federal report. And then by looking at the information as the volunteer coordinator, I'm able to fine-tune areas of ongoing education and training. Our volunteer entry is done by an experienced volunteer themselves. We do not have our volunteers entering directly into Ombuds Manager. We have one volunteer who supports the office in doing the data entry. So because she's pulling more statistical and detailed information to enter into Ombuds Manager, she recognizes some areas that are also important in identifying risk management. And she passes that on through me, and then we're able to get that filtered out and disseminated as necessary. For ongoing training, we make this a requirement for our volunteers, again, to avoid those zombie situations and the rogue volunteers. It keeps them connected to the office. Our statewide volunteer meetings, we require that our volunteers attend a minimum of 5 per year. They have networking and problem-solving opportunities during the meeting. We review policies that have been identified that people may be interpreting them differently. And then we have a continuing education session. We also provide for ongoing training opportunities for experienced volunteers to go through the certification class again. One, so that if a person hasn't gone through it in a while, it gives them a refresher. And two, it adds some depth and value to the conversation for the volunteers because they're getting information from volunteers that are actively doing what they're preparing to do. Through the statewide volunteer meetings, we also get a better idea by hearing the good, the bad, and the ugly from volunteers. That it becomes a learning collaborative. They're all able to learn from each other, and then it gives us some information in what should be provided as an education session in the next statewide meeting that we have. And lastly, some of the other policies that we've recently put in place because of those situations that crop up, is that we've recognized that at about the 9-month point after training, a volunteer is becoming comfortable with what they're doing, and they're also getting a little antsy. And it's usually at that point where we see volunteers starting to creep into the red areas and also forgetting to call in for those yellow areas. So at about the 9-month point, we either look at those volunteers and stick to ongoing education for them to make sure that they're really grounded in what they're doing, or if they've really progressed to the point that they're able to pick up another facility, then we have volunteers picking up additional facilities at that point. But not before the 9-month period, and we've made that specific also that the volunteers cannot progress onto a new facility until they have shown competencies in the facility that they're currently visiting. We also created a volunteer-based task force so that we have volunteers looking and reviewing at our policies and practices on an ongoing basis. They're involved in our training process, and they're also involved actively in recruitment and how we recruit and retain our volunteers. We have looked very closely at our decertification process, and that is one of the active committees within our task force. We've also looked at training opportunities, and this is for when a facility is reaching out to the office to have an education session offered. What we've done is we've created some blanket training materials, much like the Patient's Bill of Rights that are specific here to New Hampshire. We've created a PowerPoint presentation. As a volunteer learns how to present that information, we have them provide a demonstration to me or to someone else in the office, and then we give them the go-ahead to start offering the training. What we found prior was that volunteers were offering training sessions, and it really did vary from soup to nuts and what was being provided through those sessions. And then it really did bring some question into the integrity of the office. The other thing that we found was that as residents and elders became comfortable with the volunteers, they wanted a way to reach out to them. But we wanted to reduce and minimize that boundary area. So what we did was we created calling cards for all of our volunteers, and on those calling cards is the direct line for the office itself. So if someone within the facility is looking to speak directly to the volunteer, they call into the office, they pass on the message, and then we reach out to the volunteer to have them stop in and see that person on their next visit. The other thing that we were able to catch during that time is if there was something that was more emergent that needed to be discussed, we were able to nip things in the bud and be able to say, oh, I'm a regional long-term care ombudsman, and I can assist you with that right now if you feel comfortable talking with me. So I think I've reached the end of my presentation time. I thank you all for giving me your attention, and I am going to turn the screen back over to Amity.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Darlene. I can go ahead and change it, Darlene, back to my screen. And now is the time for questions. So we did have one question come in while you were speaking. Let me pull that up. Just one moment, please. Okay, the question was, the person that contacted us, the ombudsman, said she works in a very rural region, and she was wondering what techniques have been used to ensure that all volunteers are getting their continuing education. We've struggled to host opportunities because of the distance between volunteers. I responded with some suggestions like online training videos that are free, whether it's a previously recorded webinar training, and then getting them to respond to questions that they send in to count towards some hours of training, or having a conversation with the staff ombudsman about what they watched or listened to. Conference calls, webinars with staff and volunteers, in-person trainings as often as possible, or even mailing packets of information with questions to discuss with the staff after they read it. So those were some things that we've heard about from Newark, or that I did myself when I used to be a local ombudsman, but I'd like to hear from Sarah and Darlene if you have any other suggestions as well.
Sure. So we've been also responding to that need. In April, for Volunteer Month, we made it a concerted effort to schedule like 7 different events around the state in areas where we had clusters of volunteers to have like a half day of training and celebration because it was National Volunteer Month. So that was one way we were able to come back and connect with our volunteers after training. But primarily, we use our newsletter and our volunteer manual as avenues for people to do independent study. In our manual, we have a few pages of pre-approved continuing education materials and how they need to report those to us. We developed a simple reflection form for those. So we have a plethora of films that they could either, if they still have a video store, they could check it out. A lot of them are on Netflix or another streaming service. And we have lots of books, lots of online resources that have tons of reading material, including NORC. And then community education. We just kind of said, hey, if your local area agency on aging, your Alzheimer's Association chapter, and other types of aging-related services are hosting an educational session in your community, more than likely you're going to learn something from it you can apply to your work. So we've kind of said any of these organizations' activities would be counted. We also try to monitor that on a semi-regular basis. You know, if we see something come through on a newsletter that we get from another organization, or a volunteer says, hey, there's this thing coming up in my city, and could you put that in the newsletter? We do that too. So we have like a standing column in our newsletter for kind of new and upcoming events for continuing education, and we try to make those free. And if there's a conference, for example, that does require a fee to attend, and we have the budget to provide a scholarship for them to attend, then we have an application process for that as well. And we've sent people to caregivers conferences and the Alzheimer's conference and a guardianship conference, and we just pay their registration for that. We don't, if they want to travel, that's on them, but usually it's like right in their backyard. So we try to offer some assistance for those high quality opportunities as well. So that's what we do. And most people are getting, you know, even in the rural areas, they might be like, oh, well, I had to do it all the 10 hours kind of on my own, but, you know, they were able to complete that for us. So.
Thanks, Sarah. Darlene, did you have anything to add quickly before we go to another question?
Yes.
You may have.
So
yeah, there you go.
In New Hampshire, from the very top to the very bottom of the state is about 5 hours, and a lot of the state is rural. So what we've tried to do is find a location where the volunteers would not have to travel more than an hour to an hour and a half. We give them the listing of meetings a year in advance so that they can plan accordingly, and then we share our contact sheet with volunteers so that they can carpool if they're traveling from a distance. The other thing that we've done recently is created a closed book on closed page on Facebook, so that we can start some discussions about how we would respond to different situations, and having a virtual discussion during that, and that's been pretty successful.
Great, thank you. Okay, one more quick question came in, and then we may have to roll into our closing slides. How long from the time of training is the person certified? So I guess from the initial training until they're certified, or do they wait for a probation period before becoming certified? So basically the training process, how long does that take on average for both your programs?
For Iowa, at training, I usually tell our volunteers to estimate about 4 to 6 weeks until they get their orientation. We can wrap up their certification within a week or two of training, depending on how available they are to complete the steps that they need to complete. But the real time lag is getting that orientation scheduled, because the local needs to work around their schedule, the volunteer schedule, the facility schedule, and try to bring everybody together at a time that works. But usually it's about 4 to 6 weeks. We do not have currently a probationary period. We're just trying to think about different ways that we can monitor them effectively, have maybe more routine check-ins during that first month for 6 months, and things like that based on our experience. But we have kind of considered that, but haven't developed anything yet.
For New Hampshire, it's between 10 to 12 weeks from the time that the volunteer starts the training until the time that they're certified. And that's to get through the certification class, which is once a week for 5 weeks, and then approximately 5 weeks with their mentor. We do not have a probationary period. What we found was that it was easier to not certify someone if they weren't going to make it in that time than it was to decertify someone after we've already certified them and assigned them to a facility. So because it takes a little bit longer here in New Hampshire, we were able to, really look at, where those problem areas were and make sure that we were certifying the right people.
Yeah, that's a good point, Darlene.
Yeah, good question and great answer, everyone. Yeah, we found not necessarily a probation period, but in the program I used to work for, there was a 3-month internship period, and that simply just meant that was the length of time that it traditionally took to do initial certification training, and that as an intern volunteer, they couldn't resolve complaints because they weren't yet certified, but they could go on visits, get familiar with the facility and the residents, and then do complaint resolution training and then be certified. Because like Darlene said, it is easier to ask them to leave prior to certification than to decertify usually. There were a couple questions about decertification that came through, and they're very important questions, but only because we're working on risk management for initial training and screening right now, I'm going to hold that question till later. I can ask our presenters to respond via email, and we can send that out with the resources if that's okay, because I'd like to move along. We're a little behind time, and we still have several other slides. So red flags, that there may be something coming around the corner, something that raises your red flags for risk management would be an ombudsman fails to follow policies and procedures, they don't meet or communicate with program staff, attend meetings, unsafe decision-making or poor judgment in certain cases or responses they give to either you or residents or consumers. They may be overly involved with residents and family members and blurring those boundaries of roles, overly involved with other volunteers. So for example, if you have a fantastic mentoring program, but instead of simply mentoring someone and modeling proper ombudsman advocacy and behavior, they start managing another volunteer, then their role is a little bit blurry and needs to be clarified. And then, of course, failure to submit reports. So those are some of the red flags to look for. I was going to share some cases, but we are short on time. So just to give you an example, here's one that's a real situation. You receive a phone call from an administrator that's very upset due to a letter that went to a local newspaper from the volunteer ombudsman that happens to be assigned to that facility. And the letter to the editor is talking about general quality of care issues and long-term care, not specifically about that facility, but just the general need for advocacy for long-term care residents and that they need to be informed of their rights. Until that phone call from the administrator, you did not know that the volunteer was going to write a letter to the editor. So normally I would open up the lines for response on this, but I'm just going to walk through some basic steps on how to resolve it for the sake of time. Obviously, when you're on the phone with that administrator, you'd want to thank them for that information and inform them of the role of the ombudsman, whether it's all certified ombudsman, in being involved in providing information to the public and in systems advocacy, which bottom line, that's what that volunteer ombudsman was doing, was providing information to the public about resident rights, the volunteer or the ombudsman program, and how to contact them. You don't need to go into any other detail than that. Just explain the role of the ombudsman and let them know that you'll speak with the volunteer. Obviously, review the letter to the editor, then speak with the volunteer about the letter, and the need to communicate with staff prior to their involvement in public awareness, systems advocacy, and definitely speaking as an ombudsman. Because even as a citizen, obviously they have the right to talk about things, send letters to the editors, even testify, but that's really hard to split apart their time as a citizen, and if they're a citizen, especially speaking about long-term care issues, if they're trained and certified and a representative of the Ombudsman program, that's really hard to split apart. So informing them that there needs to be a line of communication between you and them before any of those type of actions are taken. Review your policies and procedures with them, see if there's any areas of concern that you need to make changes to, and then provide, of course, training and follow-up with all program representatives with very clear examples. So those bullet points of what I gave you is kind of what you need to rely on and kind of have a framework to respond to situations. The unexpected happened, now what do you do with it? First things first, always refer to your policies and procedures and determine if the situation can be remedied. Look at your code of conduct, code of ethics, communication, and reporting requirements. Increase connection, communication, and control that we talked about a few slides back with managing people from afar. Establish checkpoints and expectations with that individual. So once they have a clear understanding of where we kind of went off the tracks, how we can correct it and then remedy the situation and then kind of check back in the future. Of course, learn from this experience and revisit your program's procedures to make any necessary improvements. Make sure that all staff and volunteers are aware of the specific issue in question. So, for example, you don't want to just send out a blank email, a blanket email to all your representatives saying, you know, we had an issue, and being very vague about, we had an issue with communication, and, you know, for the future you need to do this. You need to really share revised policies and procedures and be direct about expectations. You cannot be vague. You can't leave any gray areas. You need to be direct as possible with your volunteers and any other program representatives. Ignoring the issue, any issue, can cause resentment, dissent, gossip, frustration, low morale, and on and on and on. So like I said, don't send a generic email saying all ombudsmen should do ABC to your volunteers without directly addressing the issue with the individual first. You can always send that email as a follow-up, but you need to follow up with that individual first. Some quick tips for addressing challenging situations, because it is really hard to provide coaching in a stressful situation when something's gone wrong. Be clear, direct, and prompt. Define the issue. Figure out if it was something to do with the individual's character, their competency, maybe their understanding of the job, or maybe just a chemistry issue with them and your program or the role of the ombudsman. Identify on your own what you've done or not done. Maybe you weren't as clear as you thought you were and there's something you could do to improve that. Focus on the problem, not the person. So this goes with any complaint resolution you're doing with residents and facilities. Focus on the problem, not the person. Don't make it personal. Be direct, specific, and non-judgmental. Develop a plan and document everything, and of course evaluate the individual situation, your response, and the impact on your program. This resource, it's linked, the link's on the slide. It talks about working with family members and effective communication skills and strategies, but it's also very helpful just with general communication in challenging situations. I plucked out 3 additional resources from other programs that really talk about risk management and are very helpful in initial certification and ongoing training with volunteers. This one's out of Texas, Walking the Fine Line. It talks about the role of the ombudsman in advocating both with and for residents while working and communicating with staff and others. So it provides helpful tips about respecting boundaries and maintaining the integrity of the ombudsman role. Great resource, and I'll include that in the follow-up materials and a link on our website. This worksheet is provided from the Massachusetts Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. It's an excellent resource that walks through scenarios. It asks the volunteer if it's appropriate or not, and then asks for comments about why it's appropriate or not in their opinion, and then gives a great conversation starter with the staff to talk about the appropriateness. This is from Maryland, and it talks about quality advocacy visits. It gives guidance to both ombudsman staff and volunteers. It's a very brief tip sheet about what they should be doing before, during, and after routine visits. All of these materials will be on our website after this webinar, and I'll send you the links directly to those materials in a follow-up email after this webinar. The NORC curriculum, the link to that is here. I encourage you to join the Volunteer Management Network listserv if you haven't already. And here's 2 websites specifically about risk management. SMP, the Senior Medicare Patrol, had a significant grant to create a risk and program management project resource, and it's excellent, so check that out. And the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is very helpful too and has some free online tutorials and a free newsletter. My contact information is on this slide, And then, of course, in closing, I would like to thank Sarah and Darlene for their excellent presentations, and thank you for joining us today, especially if this is the second time you joined this webinar. As I stated several times, the webinar recording and all materials will be posted on our website soon. For additional resources, please visit the links that I already provided, and if you have a hard time finding something or a question about this webinar, please contact me directly and I'm happy to help. As soon as this webinar closes out, you'll be directed to a very brief 5-question evaluation, and we really invite and appreciate your evaluation and feedback of this webinar. So again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We're right at 1:30, so I'm going to go ahead and close out. And thanks for all the work you do as an ombudsman. Take care.